Number 1. Stephen LaWayne Nelson. Stephen was just 23 when his name hit the news back in 2011. He'd grown up in Fort Worth, Texas, and let's just say staying out of trouble wasn't something he was known for. He'd already done time for various crimes, but nothing he'd ever done could have prepared anyone for what came next. It all started on March 3rd, 2011, at the North Point Baptist Church in Arlington. Pastor Clint Dobson, 28 years old, had started his day like any other. But that morning turned into something horrifying. According to investigators, Nelson walked into the church intending to rob it. What followed was brutal. Pastor Dobson was suffocated with a plastic bag, and the church secretary, Judy Elliott, was beaten so badly she barely made it out alive. A church, a pastor, a secretary. No one expected something this violent to happen in a place meant to offer peace and safety. When Dobson didn't return calls or messages, people at the church got worried. Police showed up and found him dead in his office. Judy Elliott, somehow still alive, gave officers what little information she could. Between her account, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence, investigators quickly zeroed in on Nelson. Days later, he was arrested and charged with capital murder. Now, Nelson insisted he wasn't the one who actually killed Dobson. He said he was just a lookout. His defense team claimed there wasn't enough physical evidence tying him directly to the murder. But prosecutors pushed back, pointing to Judy Elliott's testimony and the fact that Nelson had tried to sell stolen items from the church right after the attack. To the jury, the story was clear. In 2012, Nelson was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. And that sparked a lot of debate. Some people believed the death penalty was absolutely the right outcome. Others weren't so sure, questioning whether Nelson's exact role in the crime was ever really proven beyond a doubt. He appealed over and over again, every time the courts upheld the original decision. And in early 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take on his case, which basically sealed his fate. On February 5, 2025, Stephen Nelson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Before it happened, he gave a final statement. "I'm thankful and grateful. It is what it is. Always live for me and enjoy life." He looked at his wife, sitting in the witness room, and added, "I'm not scared. I'm at peace. Let's ride, Warden." Moments later, at 6:50 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Texas doesn't do special last meals anymore, so Nelson had the same food as everyone else that day. The menu wasn't released, just a standard prison meal. After his execution, the reactions were mixed. Pastor Dobson's family said they finally felt some sense of closure. But within the local faith community, the conversation wasn't over. Some pastors were still against the death penalty and questioned whether Nelson's full involvement had ever been truly proven. Others believed justice had been done. Even now, years later, what happened at North Point Baptist Church still haunts the people who lived through it. A place of worship turned into a crime scene. One man dead, another executed, and a community left forever changed. Number 2. Demetrius Terrence Frasier. Demetrius was 52 years old when Alabama carried out his execution on February 6, 2025. By then, he had spent decades in prison and already accepted the full weight of his actions. But his path to death row began over 30 years earlier, in a quiet Birmingham neighborhood, and with a violent crime that stunned the local community. It was November 27, 1991. Pauline Brown, a 41-year-old woman living alone, was attacked in her apartment. According to investigators, someone forced their way in, assaulted her at gunpoint, and then shot her in the head. She died on the scene. At first, police had no strong leads, and the case remained unsolved for several years. That changed unexpectedly. While Frasier was serving a life sentence in Michigan for a separate murder, this one involving a 14-year-old girl, he made a confession. During questioning, he admitted to killing Pauline Brown years earlier in Alabama. This prompted investigators to reopen the case, and they brought him back to Birmingham to stand trial. In 1996, an Alabama jury found him guilty of capital murder. Although the jury was split, with a 10-2 vote, they recommended a death sentence, something Alabama law permitted at the time. The judge followed through, and Frasier was formally sentenced to die by execution. But it would take years before Alabama could act. Michigan, where Frasier was serving his life sentence, didn't have the death penalty, and initially refused to transfer him. It wasn't until 2011 that Alabama gained full custody and began preparing for the sentence to be carried out. Throughout the legal process, Frasier never denied what happened. In fact, shortly before his execution, he offered a direct apology to Brown's family. "What happened to Pauline Brown should have never happened," he said. In the final months, his family and a group of activists asked Michigan's governor to reclaim custody to avoid the death penalty, but the request was denied. On February 6, 2025, Demetrius Frasier was executed at Holman Correctional Facility. Alabama used a relatively new method, nitrogen hypoxia. The process involved a respirator mask and the inhalation of pure nitrogen gas, which slowly removed oxygen from his bloodstream. He became one of the first individuals in the country to die by this method. Frasier gave a brief final statement just before the procedure began. "I want to apologize to the family and friends of Pauline Brown. I love everybody on death row. Detroit strong." Witnesses say that after the gas was released, he grimaced slightly and moved his legs before going still. He was pronounced dead at 6:36 p.m., roughly 13 minutes after the gas started flowing. Before the execution, Frasier was given his requested final meal: burritos, a chicken chalupa, tacos, chips and dip, and a Mountain Dew. He reportedly finished the meal earlier that day without incident. As the public learned of the execution, reactions were divided. Some focused on the use of nitrogen hypoxia and whether it should be allowed at all. Others viewed the case as a final act of justice in a crime that had haunted a family and a city for decades. Number 3. James Dennis Ford. James was 64 years old when the state of Florida carried out his execution on February 13, 2025. The journey that led him to death row had begun nearly 3 decades earlier, with a double murder that left a young family destroyed, and a toddler alone in the most unimaginable circumstances. It was a Sunday in 1997 when Ford arranged a fishing trip with his co-worker, 25-year-old Gregory Malnery, and Greg's wife, 26-year-old Kimberly. The couple had brought along their 22-month-old daughter. The plan seemed innocent: a quiet day at a remote sod farm in Charlotte County. But when the group arrived, Ford had other intentions. At some point during the outing, Ford turned violent. According to investigators, he shot Gregory in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, then bludgeoned him with a heavy axe-like tool before slitting his throat. Kimberly was assaulted next. The reports state that she was beaten, subjected to a violent sexual attack, and then shot with the same rifle. Their daughter, just shy of 2 years old, had been strapped into a car seat inside a nearby truck. She witnessed everything, or as much as any child that age could understand. She remained alone at the scene for 18 hours, covered in her mother's blood and insect bites, before search teams found her alive. The discovery of the crime scene sent shockwaves through the community. Law enforcement quickly launched an intense investigation. It didn't take long to focus on Ford. He had vanished shortly after the murders, but when police located his abandoned truck, they found critical evidence: the rifle used in the killings and several items stolen from the Malnerys. DNA testing and forensic analysis confirmed his involvement. Ford initially denied everything. He told investigators that unknown attackers must have committed the crime and framed him, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 1999, a Florida jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and child abuse. The jury recommended the death penalty by an 11-1 vote, a decision the court upheld. Over the years, Ford and his attorneys launched a long series of appeals. They argued that he suffered from an intellectual disability, pointing to an IQ score around 65. They also cited his history of alcoholism, diabetes-related blackouts, and childhood trauma. However, the courts repeatedly rejected those arguments. Judges noted that Ford was 36 years old at the time of the crime and had shown no significant mental impairment during his trial or the years that followed. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene, and his final appeal was denied just one day before the execution. On the evening of February 13, 2025, Ford was taken to the death chamber at Florida State Prison. He chose not to give a spoken final statement. Instead, prison staff read aloud a short written note he had left behind. Hugs, prayers, love. God bless everyone. Witnesses reported seeing his chest rise and fall heavily as the drugs were administered. After a routine consciousness check confirmed he was unresponsive, the procedure continued, and he was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. Eastern Time. For his final meal, Ford had requested a large Southern-style dinner: steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, a sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and a glass of sweet tea. He ate the meal earlier that day with no reported issues. The execution brought a measure of closure to the surviving family members and those who had followed the case since the late 1990s. But it also served as a grim reminder of a crime that left 2 young lives cut short. Richard was 45 years old when he was executed in Texas on February 13, 2025. His case had stretched on for over 2 decades, with moments of violent notoriety, bizarre twists, and even personal requests to speed up his own execution. But it all began over Thanksgiving weekend in 2004, with a pair of calculated killings in Killeen. That weekend, Tabler arranged a meeting with 2 men: 28-year-old Mohammed Amin Mo Rahmouni, a local strip club manager who had recently fired him, and Rahmouni's friend, 25-year-old Haitham Zayed. Tabler lured them under the pretense of a stolen goods exchange. When the 2 arrived, he ambushed them in their vehicle, shooting both at close range. According to court records, he even pulled Rahmouni from the car and filmed himself firing a second round into him. Authorities quickly connected Tabler to the crime. He was arrested soon after, and during questioning, he made a chilling admission. He also claimed to have killed 2 young women who worked at the same club: 18-year-old Tiffany Dotson and 16-year-old Amanda Benefield. Though these additional murders were never prosecuted, his own statements contributed to the overall picture of who he was and what he was capable of. In 2007, Tabler was convicted of the double murder in Killeen. The jury returned a death sentence, citing both the calculated nature of the killings and his future danger to society. His time on death row, however, would prove almost as chaotic as the crime itself. In 2008, Tabler gained national attention for smuggling a contraband cell phone into his death row cell. Using it, he made contact with a state senator and issued threatening messages, sparking a full-scale lockdown across Texas prisons. The incident raised major concerns about security and led to new restrictions inside high-risk units. Throughout the years, Tabler's behavior was unpredictable. At times, he pushed for his own execution, writing letters to the court saying he no longer wished to fight and saw no point in continuing appeals. But then, just as quickly, he would reverse course and pursue legal action to delay his sentence. His execution was first stayed in 2010 as the courts navigated these conflicting signals. But by 2024, Tabler had again requested that a date be set, saying he was ready for the process to end. Final legal efforts tried to raise concerns about his mental health and claims of ineffective legal representation. These were reviewed and rejected. The state moved forward. On February 13, 2025, Tabler entered the death chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He gave a long, emotional final statement, turning directly to the victims' families to apologize. "There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions," he said. "I had no right to take your loved ones from you, and I ask that one day you find it in your hearts to forgive me." He also thanked the prison staff for their compassion and expressed hope for peace in the next life. Just before the drugs took effect, he mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," one last time. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. Texas does not allow special last meal requests, so Tabler ate the standard prison dinner that day. His execution was the second in the state for the year. For many involved in the case, especially the families of Mohammed Rahmouni and Haitham Zayed, the moment marked the end of a long and difficult journey. Tabler's name had come up time and again over the years, but with his execution, the case finally reached its conclusion. Number 5. Brad Keith Sigman. His name had been tied to one of the state's most brutal domestic double murders, a crime that would go on to test South Carolina's execution protocols and make history in the process. On the evening of June 27, 2001, Sigman went to the home of David and Gladys Lark in Greenville County. David was a longtime father figure to Sigman's ex-girlfriend, and Sigman had reportedly been struggling to accept the end of that relationship. What followed wasn't just a confrontation, it was an eruption of violence. Armed with a baseball bat, Sigman entered the Lark home and bludgeoned both David and Gladys to death. The blows caused massive head trauma. After the killings, he attempted to find and abduct his ex-girlfriend, but was arrested later that same day. In 2002, Sigman pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. During sentencing, a jury heard about the sheer brutality of the crime, the force used, the targeting of an elderly couple, and the emotional aftermath. They recommended the death penalty, which the judge imposed. Sigman's case dragged on for years in the courts. He exhausted his final appeals by 2020, but what followed was a long delay, not because of legal arguments, but because South Carolina hadn't executed anyone since 2011. A shortage of lethal injection drugs had effectively paused executions statewide. The state legislature responded by approving alternative methods, including electrocution and firing squad. By early 2025, Brad Sigman's case became the first to move forward under these new guidelines. Given a choice between the electric chair, a newly obtained lethal injection, or the firing squad, Sigman selected the latter. In statements through his attorneys, he said he feared that the electric chair would cook him alive, and he had serious doubts about the reliability and humanity of lethal injection. In the final days, his attorneys made a last-minute appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the court declined to intervene. Governor Henry McMaster also denied clemency. At 6:01 p.m. on March 7th, Sigman entered the execution chamber at Broad River Correctional Institution. He wore a black jumpsuit, and a white cloth target was fastened to his chest. He made no final verbal statement. Instead, a few hours earlier, his attorney read a prepared message where Sigman urged lawmakers and fellow Christians to reconsider capital punishment with love, and called for an end to executions. Following procedure, a hood was placed over his head. Behind a wall, 3 volunteer executioners fired .30 caliber rifles. Witnesses reported hearing a loud groan as the bullets hit. The target cloth was torn from his chest. His body tensed, then went still. Within seconds, he was silent. A physician pronounced him dead at 6:08 p.m. Sigman became the first person in South Carolina's history to be executed by firing squad. It was a method not used in the state before, and one that instantly drew national attention. Officials later confirmed that all 3 shots struck his heart. For his last meal, which he received 2 days prior per state policy, Sigman requested a traditional Southern spread: 4 pieces of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. The case had been delayed for over 2 decades, but when the state finally acted, it marked not only the end of Sigman's legal road, but the beginning of a new and controversial chapter in how South Carolina enforces the death penalty. Number 6. Jesse Allen Hoffman. His case marked a turning point in the state's criminal justice history, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the method used to carry out his sentence. It was the first execution Louisiana had performed in 15 years. Back in 1996, Hoffman was just 18, working as a parking lot attendant in downtown New Orleans. Each day, 28-year-old Mary Molly Elliott parked her car in that lot on her lunch break. According to investigators, on November 27th of that year, Hoffman kidnapped her during one of those routine stops. He drove her across state lines into a remote area of St. Tammany Parish. There, he assaulted her and ultimately shot her in the head. Her body was found the next morning near a boat launch by the Pearl River. For several months, the case went cold. Then, Hoffman was arrested in Michigan on unrelated charges, and during his time in custody, he confessed to Elliott's murder. He was extradited back to Louisiana, where prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder. In 1998, a jury convicted him and sentenced him to death. The case might have faded into the long list of capital convictions, but Louisiana had not executed anyone since 2010. A lack of available lethal injection drugs created a years-long pause in all death penalty activity. That changed in 2024, when the state authorized nitrogen hypoxia as a legal alternative. Hoffman's case was among the first to move forward under the new method. His legal team fought to stop the execution. They challenged the use of nitrogen gas as cruel and unusual punishment, arguing that it could cause visible suffering. Hoffman also raised religious concerns, saying the procedure conflicted with his Buddhist beliefs. For a time, a federal court issued a temporary stay, but that was overturned by the Fifth U.S. Circuit and then upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in a narrow 5-4 ruling, just hours before the scheduled execution. Hoffman had asked to be executed by firing squad or traditional lethal injection instead. Louisiana declined. State officials moved ahead with nitrogen gas, making this the first time the method was used in the state. On March 18th, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola, Hoffman was strapped to a gurney inside the execution chamber. He wore an airtight mask connected to a nitrogen gas system. He declined to make a final statement, and he refused a last meal. At 6:31 p.m., the nitrogen flow began. Witnesses reported that Hoffman showed signs of physical reaction, gasping, twitching, and slight convulsions. After about 13 minutes, he stopped moving. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. Prison officials later stated that he lost consciousness within seconds and that the physical movements were expected. But some observers questioned the method's humaneness after seeing those reactions firsthand. One final detail stood out. Though Hoffman had confessed decades earlier, his wife and spiritual advisor claimed that in his last moments, he maintained his innocence, whispering, "I did not kill her." However, all appeals asserting otherwise had long been denied by the courts. For Molly Elliott's family, the execution ended a chapter that had remained open for nearly 3 decades. But for Louisiana, it also reopened questions about how, and whether, the state should carry out capital punishment in the future. Number 7. Aaron Brian Gunches. Aaron was 53 years old when he was executed in Arizona on March 19, 2025. His case wasn't just about the crime, it also became known for how he responded to his punishment. Unlike many on death row, Gunches volunteered for execution and openly stated that he accepted the sentence, believing it was time for the case to come to an end. The story began back in December 2002. Gunches, who had a history of violent offenses and was out on parole, targeted 42-year-old Ted Price, his ex-girlfriend's former husband. According to court records, Gunches abducted Price in the Phoenix area and drove him into the desert just outside of Mesa. There, during what prosecutors described as a deliberate ambush, Gunches shot him multiple times and left his body in the remote terrain. The motive wasn't entirely clear, but authorities said it stemmed from a mix of personal conflict and unresolved anger. The investigation led back to Gunches quickly. Evidence tied him to the scene, and when questioned, he eventually admitted to the killing. In 2007, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to death by an Arizona court. For years, the case sat quietly, with Gunches held at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. But things changed in late 2022 when Gunches made a rare move. He asked the Arizona Supreme Court to expedite his execution. He publicly stated that he was done fighting and wanted to accept responsibility for what he had done. A death warrant was granted in 2023, but a review of Arizona's execution procedures paused all scheduled executions for over 2 years. That pause ended in 2025 when the state revised its lethal injection protocols, including new procedures for IV line placement. With those changes in place, Arizona resumed executions. Gunches dropped all remaining legal challenges and waived his appeals. In a statement released by the Attorney General, Gunches said, "Justice for Ted Price and his family was finally served." Despite his cooperation, the case still went through the usual review process. The State Clemency Board declined to recommend mercy, and final motions for a stay were denied by both state and federal courts. The execution was cleared to proceed. On the morning of March 19th, Gunches was led into the execution chamber at the Florence prison. When asked if he wanted to make a final statement, he shook his head silently, choosing not to speak. He was strapped to the gurney, and the lethal injection began shortly after. Witnesses reported that Gunches took a few heavy breaths and let out a low, snoring-like sound before falling unconscious. Officials said the process went smoothly and without complications. He was pronounced dead at 10:33 a.m. Gunches had requested a large final meal the night before, a double bacon cheeseburger, 2 deli sandwiches, French fries, onion rings, and baklava for dessert. According to prison staff, he finished the meal without incident. Though he remained quiet in his final moments, Gunches had expressed written remorse to Ted Price's family in the days before his death. He apologized for the pain he caused and hoped his execution would bring them closure after more than 2 decades. For Arizona, the execution marked the state's first in over 2 years. But for the Price family, it closed a case that began with an ambush in the desert and ended with a final act of accountability. Number 8. Wendel Ardan Grysom. His name had become associated with one of the state's most disturbing home invasions, an act of violence that left 2 people dead, a mother wounded, and 2 young children forever marked by what they narrowly survived. It happened in the early morning hours of November 3, 2005. Grysom and a hitchhiker named Jesse Johns randomly selected a rural home in Blaine County. Inside was Drew Kopf, a mother of 2, recovering from recent surgery. Her best friend, 26-year-old Amber Matthews, had stayed the night to help care for the kids. What was supposed to be a quiet night turned into a nightmare. Grysom and Johns broke into the house without warning. Drew Kopf tried to reason with them, offering anything they wanted if they would just leave. But it didn't matter. Grysom opened fire, shooting Drew multiple times. Amber, trying to protect the children, hid in a bedroom with the infant. Grysom followed her. According to court testimony, she begged for her life. He shot her at close range. Somehow, Drew survived. Bleeding from multiple wounds, she managed to escape and alert neighbors. Law enforcement launched a manhunt, and within days, Grysom and Johns were arrested. Evidence from the scene and their own statements confirmed what had taken place. While Johns received life without parole, Grysom, who pulled the trigger, was charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple related felonies. At his 2008 trial, prosecutors emphasized the randomness and brutality of the attack. The jury heard how Amber Matthews had died while protecting children, and how Drew Kopf had lived through something no one should. Grysom was found guilty on all counts. The jury recommended the death penalty, citing the sheer cruelty of the crime and the vulnerability of those inside the home. For nearly 17 years, Grysom sat on death row. In early 2025, he came before Oklahoma's Pardon and Parole Board. His legal team argued that he suffered from developmental brain issues, pointing to abnormal scans and a history of childhood trauma. They said he had been a model prisoner, helping others and taking full responsibility for his actions. His attorneys also emphasized that Grysom had expressed deep remorse and had even written letters of apology to the victims' families. But in the end, those arguments weren't enough. The board voted 4-1 against clemency. Survivors and prosecutors stressed that justice had been delayed long enough and that the nature of the crime outweighed any claims of redemption. On March 20th, 2025, Wendel Grysom was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was given the chance to speak but declined. Witnesses said he appeared calm. The drugs were administered, and Grysom's breathing slowed. His chest rose and fell a few times before becoming still. He was pronounced dead at 10:13 a.m. Because of Oklahoma's policy, his last meal was served the day before. He requested nothing special and reportedly spent his final hours in quiet prayer. Afterward, the family of Amber Matthews released a statement. They said that while nothing could undo the pain, this final step brought some sense of peace, and the knowledge that Grysom would never again harm another person. Number 9. James Edward Thomas. James was 63 years old when he was executed in Florida on March 20th, 2025. His name had haunted the state for more than 3 decades, tied to one of the most horrifying crimes in Central Florida's recent history, a case that left an 8-year-old girl dead, a grandmother brutally murdered, and a household shattered. The crime took place on the night of September 19th, 1993. James, known as Eddie, was staying as a boarder in the Castleberry home of 58-year-old Betty Dick. That night, Betty's granddaughter, 8-year-old Toni Nooner, and 3 other children were staying over. According to investigators, James consumed a staggering amount of alcohol and drugs, 24 beers, gin, and LSD. Then, under the influence, he launched into a violent and deadly rampage. He sexually assaulted and strangled young Toni, and when Betty Dick tried to intervene, he stabbed her 21 times. The other children survived physically unharmed, but were left traumatized by what they had witnessed. James fled the scene, stealing Betty's car and jewelry. He made it all the way to California before being caught weeks later. He was found driving the stolen vehicle, with the stolen jewelry still in his possession. During questioning, he confessed to the murders on videotape. That confession became a key part of the prosecution's case. In 1995, a Florida jury convicted James of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and multiple related charges. The jurors unanimously recommended the death penalty. The judge handed down 3 death sentences for Toni's murder, the sexual assault, and a related child abuse charge, and a life sentence for the killing of Betty Dick. James remained on Florida's death row for nearly 30 years. During that time, he filed repeated appeals. His attorneys argued that a lifetime of substance abuse, head trauma, and a 2023 heart attack had left him mentally unfit for execution. But Florida's courts found that he remained competent and rejected the idea that age or cognitive decline exempted him from responsibility. His execution was briefly halted in 2022 due to an issue with the state's lethal injection drugs. But once the protocols were corrected, Governor Ron DeSantis signed a new death warrant in early 2025. On the day of the execution, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. James claimed he had no memory of what happened that night due to intoxication, but he never denied responsibility. He said little publicly in the years that followed and remained mostly silent in the final days of his life. On March 20th, 2025, at Florida State Prison, James entered the execution chamber. He was asked if he wished to make a final statement, but he declined. As the lethal injection began, witnesses reported that he breathed heavily, and his arms and chest twitched briefly before going still. He was pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Prison officials later released a short written message he had left behind. It read, "Hugs, prayer, love. God bless everyone." He spent his final hours meeting with clergy, but showed little emotion during the procedure itself. James had made no special request for a last meal, and instead ate the standard prison dinner the evening before. In the witness room were now-grown survivors of that horrific night, observing as the case finally came to an end. Florida's Department of Corrections stated that the execution proceeded without complications. For the families and victims involved, the moment marked the close of a long, painful chapter, one that had begun in chaos and ended in silence. Number 10. Mikall Anthony Tanzy. Mikall Anthony Tanzy was 48 years old when Florida executed him on April 8, 2025. His case stood out not only for its brutality, but also because Tanzy himself would later admit that his actions marked the start of what he called a serial killing spree, one that authorities stopped just in time. It began on April 25, 2000. Janet Acosta, a 49-year-old woman, had parked her car to eat lunch in Miami. As she sat in her vehicle, Tanzy approached her with a knife. He had recently gone AWOL from a halfway house and was looking for a way to flee the area. Instead, he abducted Acosta at knife point, forcing her into her own van and driving north through Florida. Over the course of that terrifying journey, Tanzy repeatedly assaulted her and forced her to withdraw cash from an ATM. Eventually, near Cujo Key in the Florida Keys, he strangled her with a ligature. He then buried her body in a remote wooded area and continued using her credit cards to buy clothing and other items. 2 days later, police arrested Tanzy in Key West. He was found driving Acosta's van, wearing new clothes purchased with her money, and still using her cards. In custody, he quickly confessed. He even led detectives to where he had buried her. Tanzy's past soon came into focus. He admitted to committing another murder in Massachusetts a year earlier, further fueling speculation that he had been targeting women across state lines. Media at the time dubbed him the Casanova Killer, noting his charm and manipulation during the crimes. In 2003, Tanzy pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual battery, and armed robbery. A Florida jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. In the years that followed, his legal team pursued several appeals. They highlighted Tanzy's troubled upbringing, claims of childhood abuse, untreated mental illness, and alleged poor representation during sentencing. One of the final arguments focused on his weight. Tanzy had grown to over 380 pounds, and attorneys suggested it might make lethal injection unsafe, but the court found no medical basis to delay the execution. Governor Ron DeSantis signed Tanzy's death warrant in March 2025. In the final weeks, Tanzy began speaking openly about his crimes. In a letter to the Miami Herald, he called himself a fledgling serial killer and said he fully accepted the death penalty, even stating that he deserved it. On the evening of April 8th, Tanzy was led into the death chamber at Florida State Prison. When given the chance to speak, he turned to the witnesses and apologized to Janet Acosta's family. Then he quoted from the Bible, reciting Luke 23:34. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He lifted his head briefly to look at those watching, then laid back as the chemicals were administered. Witnesses described him mouthing prayers and closing his eyes. Due to his size, a second dose of sedative was administered as a precaution. Still, the procedure proceeded without major issue. He was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. For his last meal, Tanzy requested comfort food, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, gravy, and ice cream. But reportedly, due to anxiety, he ate only a small portion. After the execution, officials in Florida and Massachusetts expressed a sense of closure. While Tanzy had never been tried for the earlier murder he claimed, his death brought justice to the family of Janet Acosta, a woman whose life was stolen in a random act of cruelty that Tanzy never denied. Number 11. Mikall Dean Mai. His case spanned multiple states and left behind a trail of devastation, including the loss of a respected public safety officer, a gas station clerk, and possibly more. But it was the murder of Captain James Jim Myers that would ultimately send Mahdi to death row. It was July 15, 2004, and Captain Myers, a 56-year-old veteran of the Orangeburg Department of Public Safety, had pulled over to help what looked like a stranded motorist along a quiet South Carolina road. That motorist was Mahdi, a fugitive from Virginia who was on the run. What Myers didn't know was that Mahdi had already committed a violent robbery and killed a gas station clerk in Winston-Salem, North Carolina just the day before. When Myers approached, Mahdi ambushed him, took his service weapon, and shot him with it. Myers died at the scene. Mahdi then fled, triggering a multi-state manhunt. Authorities eventually caught him days later. He later admitted to both killings and, in a plea deal to avoid federal charges, confessed in court. He also claimed, though never verified, that he had committed a third murder in Virginia during that same week, tied to a drug dispute. In 2005, Mahdi stood trial for the murder of Captain Myers. The jury was presented with evidence of both murders and his confessions. Prosecutors described the attack on Myers as cold-blooded and calculated. The jury convicted Mahdi and sentenced him to death, pointing to the unprovoked killing of a public servant and the violent spree that preceded it. Mahdi spent nearly 2 decades on South Carolina's death row. During that time, he underwent what his legal team called a transformation. He expressed deep remorse, became a practicing Buddhist, and gained a reputation as a model inmate. He even sought to donate his organs after death, but those efforts did not sway the state. Final appeals, based on spiritual objections to nitrogen gas and concerns over execution secrecy, were dismissed. Mahdi ultimately chose to die by firing squad, making him just the second person executed by that method in modern South Carolina history. On the evening of April 11, 2025, at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, Mahdi entered the execution chamber. He was seated upright, strapped to a chair with a target fixed over his chest. When offered the chance to speak, he said nothing, just sat still, staring ahead. At 6:01 p.m., a hood was placed over his head. Behind a wall, 3 volunteer executioners raised their rifles and fired in unison. Witnesses heard a loud groan as the bullets hit, followed by a few softer sounds and shallow breathing. His body twitched briefly. By 6:05 p.m., he was silent, and a physician entered to confirm death. Officials later said any movements observed were involuntary reflexes, not signs of suffering. Mahdi's last meal was served 2 days before the execution. A medium ribeye steak, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. He reportedly finished everything on the eve of his death. For the family of Captain Myers, the execution marked the end of a long, painful road. Myers had pulled over that day simply to help someone in need, an act of kindness that cost him his life. And while Mahdi's story became one of transformation behind bars, the state never lost sight of the lives that were lost in those few violent days back in 2004. Number 12. Moyes Sandoval Mendoza. Moyes was 41 years old when Texas carried out his execution on April 23, 2025. His case was one of the most deeply painful in recent memory, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the young life it ended and the child it left behind. Back in March 2004, 20-year-old Rochelle Tolleson was home alone in Farmersville, Texas. She was a young mother, raising her 5-month-old daughter, and living a quiet life in a small community. That day, Mendoza, also 20 years old at the time, targeted her. He broke into her home, abducted her, and took her to a remote location. According to investigators, he sexually assaulted her, then strangled and stabbed her before burning her body in an attempt to destroy the evidence. Rochelle's disappearance triggered a massive search effort. For 6 days, her family, neighbors, and law enforcement combed the area. Finally, in a field outside town, they found her charred remains. The discovery devastated the community. Mendoza was arrested shortly after. He initially confessed to the murder, but denied parts of the assault. Still, the physical evidence, his own admissions, and the timeline led prosecutors to charge him with capital murder. In 2005, a Collin County jury convicted him and unanimously sentenced him to death. Jurors cited the cruelty of the crime and the fact that Rochelle's baby had been left behind, helpless and alone, as key reasons for imposing the death penalty. For the next 20 years, Mendoza lived on Texas death row. His attorneys filed numerous appeals, including a major claim that prosecutors had misled the jury during sentencing by presenting questionable testimony about his supposed future dangerousness in prison. But in April 2025, just weeks before the scheduled execution, Texas courts rejected the argument. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles also unanimously denied clemency. As his execution date approached, Mendoza wrote a letter to Rochelle Tollison's family. In it, he accepted full responsibility for her death and said he hoped his execution would not be in vain. He apologized directly to her parents and expressed a desire that they find peace. On April 23rd, exactly 21 years to the day after the crime, Mendoza was led into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. He gave a brief final statement, turning toward the victim's family. "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rochelle's life," he said. "I apologize. Thank you for being here today." He also addressed his own loved ones, saying that he was at peace and ready to face what was coming. As the pentobarbital was administered, Mendoza prayed aloud, asking for forgiveness, and saying he hoped to meet Rochelle in the next life to apologize to her in person. Witnesses described him as emotional but composed. He was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m. Under Texas policy, no special last meal was allowed. Mendoza ate the same dinner as other inmates that evening: chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The execution marked the third carried out in Texas in 2025. For the family of Rochelle Tollison, the date was symbolic, exactly 2 decades since she was taken from them. In their view, it was the final step in a long and painful process, one that had demanded patience, but ultimately brought justice. Number 13. James Edward Ozgood. James, known as Buddy to those who once knew him, was 55 years old when Alabama executed him on April 24, 2025. His name became permanently tied to one of the most disturbing crimes in the state's recent memory, a case that involved betrayal, cruelty, and a final act of acceptance from the killer himself. It happened in October 2010 in Chilton County. Ozgood and his girlfriend, who was also the cousin of 44-year-old Tracy Lynn Brown, had spent months planning a crime that stemmed from violent fantasies. Prosecutors later revealed that the couple had discussed abduction and torture scenarios, and eventually decided to make them real. They lured Tracy to her own home, under the pretense of helping with errands, and once inside, they turned on her. According to court records, the pair tied Tracy up at gunpoint and forced her into degrading acts. Then, Ozgood took a knife and slit her throat while his girlfriend watched. They left the scene without calling for help. Tracy's co-workers, concerned when she didn't show up to work, discovered her body the next morning. Ozgood confessed to the crime in detail after his arrest. He told investigators that the plan had been carefully thought out, and that he fully intended for Tracy not to survive. His girlfriend was also charged and received a lengthy prison sentence. In 2014, a jury convicted Ozgood of capital murder during the course of a rape and burglary. By an 11-to-1 vote, they recommended the death penalty, and the judge imposed it. Years later, that sentence was overturned on a procedural issue. But during resentencing in 2018, Ozgood again asked for death. Number 14. Jeffrey Allen Hutchinson. Jeffrey Allen Hutchinson was 62 years old when Florida executed him on May 1, 2025. His case had haunted the state for nearly 3 decades because what he did on a single night in 1998 left a family completely destroyed. Hutchinson, a Gulf War veteran, had been living in Crestview, Florida, with his girlfriend, 32-year-old Renee Flaherty, and her 3 young children, Jeffrey, age 9, Amanda, age 7, and 4-year-old Logan. He was dealing with severe post-traumatic stress, had a long history of alcohol abuse, and often acted paranoid. But until that night, no one imagined how far it would go. On September 12, 1998, following a drunken argument inside the house, Hutchinson snapped. He retrieved a 12-gauge shotgun and shot Renee in the head. Then, one by one, he turned the weapon on the children, methodically shooting each of them. All 4 died at the scene. What happened next was chilling. Hutchinson called 911 himself. In a calm voice, he told the dispatcher, "I just shot my family." When officers arrived, they found him sitting in the garage, the phone still in his hand, gunshot residue on his clothes, and the weapon nearby. In 2001, a Florida jury found him guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jurors unanimously recommended the death penalty for the children's murders, but spared him on Renee's count, resulting in a life sentence for her death. The court emphasized the especially heinous nature of the crime. Not only had he slaughtered an entire family, but he had done so deliberately and without hesitation. Over the years, Hutchinson's legal team focused on his military service and mental health. They argued that he suffered from Gulf War syndrome, PTSD, and paranoid delusions. At one point, he claimed that 2 government agents had entered the home and killed the family to silence him. He insisted he was being framed. Courts reviewed these claims in detail, but ultimately rejected them. Judges ruled that Hutchinson was fully aware of his actions. His 9/11 confession, physical evidence, and lack of credible alternative explanations left little doubt. A final psychiatric evaluation in 2025 determined that Hutchinson's delusions were either feigned or unrelated to the crime itself. He was ruled competent to face execution. Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant earlier that year, and all remaining appeals were denied. Hutchinson never admitted guilt, never showed remorse, and until the end, maintained the 2 intruders theory. On May 1, 2025, at Florida State Prison, Hutchinson was brought into the death chamber. When asked for a final statement, he declined. As the sedative began to flow, witnesses noticed him muttering to himself. His lips moved, but no words were clearly heard. His legs trembled slightly, and his body twitched for a couple of minutes before he went completely still. The process took longer than most, about 15 minutes in total. He was pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m. He had declined a special last meal. According to prison records, he ate a standard dinner of chicken patties and rice the night before, but refused breakfast on the day of execution. Officers said he was visibly anxious, but compliant. Afterward, Renee Flaherty's surviving family released a statement, saying that while nothing could bring back their loved ones, the execution finally closed the legal chapter on a tragedy that had stretched on for 27 years. Number 15. Glenn Edward Rogers. Glenn Edward Rogers was 62 years old when he was executed in Florida on May 15, 2025. For decades, his name was linked to a series of chilling crimes across the United States, earning him the nickname the Cross-Country Killer. But it was the 1995 murder of a woman in Tampa that ultimately led to his death sentence in Florida. The victim was 34-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs. On November 5, 1995, she met Rogers at a bar in Tampa. Rogers, then a drifter working carnival jobs, came across as charming and relaxed. He left the bar with Cribbs, and they checked into a nearby motel. What happened inside that room would soon trigger a nationwide manhunt. According to investigators, Rogers robbed and stabbed Tina to death, leaving her body in the motel bathtub. He then stole her car and fled the state. 2 days passed before her body was discovered, and by then, Rogers had already crossed state lines. Authorities tracked his movements as he used Cribb's stolen credit cards and continued traveling. His run ended in Kentucky, where police arrested him after a high-speed chase. He was still driving Cribb's car. In 1997, Rogers was convicted in Florida of first-degree murder and robbery. The jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. But that wasn't the only case tied to him. Weeks before Tina's murder, Rogers had killed another woman, Sandra Gallagher, 37, in California. He was later convicted in that case as well and received a second death sentence. Over time, Rogers became known in the media as both the cross-country killer and the Casanova killer. He claimed to have killed up to 70 people, though that number was never verified, and he later walked back the claim. He was also featured in a 2012 documentary where his brother speculated about a connection between Rogers and the infamous 1994 O.J. Simpson case. But investigators dismissed the theory as baseless. For nearly 30 years, Rogers lived on death row. His appeals focused on alleged brain damage, an abusive upbringing, and long-term substance abuse. But courts repeatedly found that his crimes were deliberate and calculated. His own words, his confessions, and twisted boasts undermined every claim of diminished responsibility. In early 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Rogers' death warrant, noting his unusually long time on death row. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. Although Rogers had also received a death sentence in California, the two states agreed that Florida would carry out its sentence first. On May 15th, Rogers was led into the death chamber at Florida State Prison. He declined a last meal, telling staff he wasn't hungry. When given a chance to speak, he delivered a short 2-minute statement. He did not address his victims or their families. Instead, he thanked his spiritual advisor, expressed love for his relatives, and quoted a Bible verse about forgiveness. His final words included a quiet remark, "I'm ready to go home." As the lethal drugs were administered, Rogers closed his eyes and showed a faint smile. Witnesses said he stopped breathing within 7 minutes. No complications were reported. Some family members of other unsolved cases tied to Rogers' name were in the viewing room, watching silently. While many questions about his past remain unanswered, the state of Florida said the execution removed a dangerous predator who had spent years targeting vulnerable women across the country. Number 16. Benjamin Robert Richie. Benjamin Robert Richie was 45 years old when Indiana executed him on May 20th, 2025. His name had remained in the headlines for years, not just because of the officer he killed, but because of the long legal battle that followed. For the family of Lieutenant William Bill Toney, the end had been a long time coming. It was just after midnight on August 10th, 2000, in Beech Grove, a suburb of Indianapolis. Richie, then 20 years old, was already known to police, a violent offender with prior armed robbery convictions, and at the time, he was considered an escapee from a work release program. When a routine traffic stop turned into a high-speed chase, Lieutenant Toney pursued Richie until the suspect crashed and ran on foot. What happened next was a calculated ambush. As Lieutenant Toney closed in on him, Richie lay in wait and fired 2 shots, fatally striking the officer. Toney died shortly after. Richie was arrested later that same day. His actions triggered outrage across Indiana's law enforcement community. In 2002, a jury convicted Richie of capital murder of a police officer. The decision to recommend death was unanimous. Prosecutors emphasized his criminal history, his escape status, and the cold-blooded way he had killed an officer during the line of duty. But even after the sentence was handed down, the process was far from over. Richie was transferred to federal prison for unrelated charges, and for years, Indiana authorities fought to regain custody so they could carry out the sentence. That wasn't achieved until early 2023 under a federal-state agreement. His legal team raised multiple appeals over the years, They cited potential jury bias, alleged mental illness, and claimed Richie suffered from brain trauma during childhood. But those arguments were consistently rejected by both state and federal courts. In 2025, the Indiana Parole Board voted unanimously against clemency. The governor agreed. In the final months of his life, Richie stopped fighting the inevitable. He focused instead on visits with his family and spiritual advisors. Those close to him said he spent his final days in reflection. On May 20th, just after midnight, Richie was executed by lethal injection at Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. Unlike most executions, this one was carried out without the presence of media. Indiana's Department of Correction, citing a controversial state law, barred reporters from witnessing the procedure, a decision that drew criticism and failed legal challenges from news organizations. Attorneys who were present later described what they saw. As the pentobarbital entered his system, Richie's body jolted sharply, his shoulders lifting off the gurney. He twitched for several seconds before settling back down. A curtain was drawn shortly after the injection began, blocking the rest of the execution from public view. Prison officials insisted everything went as planned. Richie was pronounced dead at 12:46 a.m. Just before the drugs were administered, he gave a short final statement. "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." These were the only public words he shared in the years following his conviction. For his last meal, Richie requested the Tour of Italy platter from Olive Garden, lasagna, fettuccine alfredo, and chicken parmesan. He reportedly joked with guards that it was his favorite comfort food. After the execution, the family of Lieutenant Tony released a statement saying justice had been served. "No matter how long it takes," they said, "Indiana will hold murderers accountable." Number 17. Matthew Lee Johnson. Matthew Lee Johnson was 49 years old when he was executed in Texas on May 20th, 2025. His death came exactly 13 years to the day after the horrific crime that put him on death row. A senseless act that took the life of a beloved grandmother and shocked the entire Garland community. It happened on May 20th, 2012. Johnson, high on drugs and carrying a plastic jug of lighter fluid, entered a gas station in Garland, Texas. Behind the counter was 76-year-old Nancy Harris, a store clerk known locally for her kindness, warmth, and dedication to her job. What happened next was as cruel as it was baffling. Johnson demanded cash, and when Harris complied, he doused her in lighter fluid and set her on fire before walking out of the store with just $50. Customers rushed in moments later to find Nancy Harris engulfed in flames. She suffered third-degree burns over most of her body and was rushed to the hospital, where she held on for 5 agonizing days before dying from her injuries. Police arrested Johnson within hours. He admitted to what he'd done, but insisted he hadn't meant to kill her, that he thought the fire would only frighten her. The courts didn't see it that way. In 2013, a Dallas County jury convicted him of capital murder, noting that he had committed the killing during a robbery and used arson as the means. His prior record, which included violent felonies, weighed heavily in the sentencing phase. The jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Over the years, Johnson's appeals argued that his actions were reckless rather than premeditated murder. His defense claimed he was intoxicated and incapable of fully understanding what he was doing. But the courts rejected those arguments, pointing out the graphic nature of the attack and the complete lack of mercy shown to an elderly, unarmed woman. One unusual appeal accused prosecutors of date shopping, or deliberately selecting a symbolic date for the execution to maximize media attention. That claim, too, was dismissed by the courts. As the years passed, Johnson's legal avenues closed one by one. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case in 2024. The Texas Board of Pardons unanimously denied clemency. In prison, Johnson underwent a noticeable change. He became an ordained minister and frequently led prayer groups for other inmates. He often spoke of Nancy Harris in those gatherings, saying he prayed daily for forgiveness and hoped that her family would one day find peace. On the evening of May 20th, 2025, Johnson was led into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. In his final statement, he turned toward Harris's family and said, "I never meant to hurt Ms. Harris. I pray that she's the first person I see when I open my eyes, and I will spend eternity with her." He then thanked his wife and children for supporting him through the darkest time of his life. As the drugs began to flow, Johnson's eyes welled with tears. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," one final time. Within a minute, he fell unconscious, and his body stopped moving. Witnesses noted that his face first turned red, then slowly paled as his heartbeat faded. He was pronounced dead at 6:53 p.m. Texas no longer provides special last meals, so Johnson received the standard prison tray: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. He barely touched the food, instead spending his final hours in prayer with his chaplain. Nancy Harris's family watched the execution in silence. Afterward, they said they accepted Johnson's apology, and that seeing justice done on the anniversary of her murder brought a measure of peace they had waited 13 long years to find. Number 18. Oscar Franklin Smith. Oscar Franklin Smith was 72 years old when he was executed in Tennessee on May 22, 2025, closing the chapter on one of the state's longest-running capital punishment cases. For over 3 decades, Smith had remained on death row after being convicted of a devastating triple homicide that tore apart his own family. The crime occurred on October 1, 1989, in a quiet neighborhood in Nashville. Smith, estranged from his wife Judith and in conflict over finances and custody, entered the family's home in the early morning hours. There, prosecutors said, he carried out a brutal attack, shooting Judith Smith in the neck with a shotgun before turning on her 2 teenage sons from a previous marriage, 16-year-old Chad Burnett and 13-year-old Jason Burnett, both of whom were stabbed and shot in their bedrooms. The crime scene was described by first responders as one of the most disturbing they had ever witnessed. Investigators later matched a bloody fingerprint and shoe prints to Oscar Smith, linking him directly to the murders. Smith denied all involvement, but in 1990, a jury found him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. Over the next 34 years, Smith's legal team pursued every possible avenue to overturn his sentence. He consistently maintained his innocence, claiming the forensic evidence was either misinterpreted or flawed. At one point, he gained national attention in April 2022 when his execution was paused just hours before it was to be carried out, due to concerns over the state's lethal injection protocol. That reprieve was temporary. In 2023, Tennessee revised its procedures and adopted a single drug protocol using pentobarbital. Smith's execution was reset, and though his attorneys raised additional claims, including newly surfaced psychological trauma from his childhood, courts ultimately denied all final motions. Governor Bill Lee, who had earlier halted executions to review the process, declined to grant clemency. On May 22, 2025, Oscar Smith was led into the execution chamber at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. At 10:47 a.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection. In his final words, Smith spent over 3 minutes declaring his innocence and criticizing the justice system. He called out the governor by name, saying, "If you think every man on death row is guilty, you're a damned fool." He also spoke about forgiveness, claiming the system had failed both his family and the truth. Smith requested the presence of his spiritual advisor during the procedure, and as the drugs were administered, the advisor recited a liturgy and softly sang, "I'll Fly Away." Witnesses said Smith's complexion quickly changed from red to a bluish purple as the pentobarbital took effect. His body gave a few small twitches before going still. He was declared dead approximately 7 minutes after the injection began. He had declined a traditional last meal, choosing instead to fast and pray with his minister during his final night. According to prison staff, he remained composed and focused on spiritual preparation. After the execution, relatives of Judith Smith and her sons issued a brief public statement. They said they had faith in the justice system's conclusion and hoped that sharing their story would encourage others to take signs of domestic violence seriously before it's too late. Number 19. Anthony Ray Wainwright. Anthony Ray Wainwright was executed in Florida on June 10, 2025, closing a grim case that had lingered for over 3 decades. At age 54, Wainwright had spent nearly 30 years on death row for the 1994 killing of 23-year-old Carmen Sanders Gayhart, a young mother whose life was brutally stolen during a random, violent abduction. The crime took place on April 27, 1994. Wainwright and an accomplice, Richard Hamilton, had escaped from a prison in North Carolina and were on the run. Their flight from justice turned deadly when they encountered Carmen in a Winn-Dixie grocery store parking lot in Lake City, Florida. Armed and desperate, they kidnapped her at gunpoint. The two men forced Carmen into her own vehicle and drove her to a remote wooded area. There, Wainwright sexually assaulted her and then shot her in the head, leaving her body behind before fleeing the scene in her stolen car. The suspects were arrested just days later in Mississippi after a shootout with police. Officers found Carmen's vehicle and stolen possessions in their possession. In 1995, Wainwright was convicted by a Florida jury of first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and sexual battery. The jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, while Hamilton received a life sentence. He later died in prison of natural causes in 2023. Wainwright's case moved slowly through the courts for the next 30 years. His attorneys cited childhood abuse, substance dependence, and claimed that Hamilton had been the mastermind. But appellate courts consistently rejected those arguments, noting Wainwright's direct role in both the assault and murder. A final wave of appeals in early 2025 challenged Florida's lethal injection procedures, but the courts ruled the process constitutional and allowed the execution to proceed. Governor Ron DeSantis signed Wainwright's death warrant shortly afterward. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene, effectively clearing the last legal barrier. In his final clemency hearing, Wainwright showed little remorse, instead deflecting blame onto his now-deceased accomplice. Carmen Gayhart's family, particularly her mother-in-law, had long advocated for justice, describing the immense suffering Carmen endured and the pain their family carried for decades. On June 10, 2025, Wainwright was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. When asked if he had any last words, he appeared to respond, but the statement was inaudible to witnesses behind the glass. Officials later said he offered a brief apology, though it was so quiet that even the victim's family couldn't make out what he said. Once the lethal drugs were administered, Wainwright closed his eyes and appeared to fall unconscious within moments. There were no unusual reactions, and the execution proceeded without visible distress. He was pronounced dead at 6:22 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Unlike some inmates, Wainwright did not request a final spiritual advisor or special religious rites. He also declined a traditional last meal, eating only a sandwich and milk earlier in the day. Florida Department of Corrections staff noted he remained calm in his final hours. Afterward, Carmen Gayhart's family spoke briefly to reporters. They emphasized that while the execution would never erase their pain or bring Carmen back, it did bring an end to a long and painful legal process. They said they were relieved to no longer see Wainwright's name appear in court filings and appeals, and that for them, the focus could finally return to remembering Carmen's life rather than reliving her final moments. Number 20. Gregory Gerald Hunt. Gregory Gerald Hunt was executed in Alabama on June 10, 2025, after spending 35 years on death row for one of the most brutal crimes in the state's history. He was 65 years old at the time of his death and had been convicted for the 1988 killing of 32-year-old Karen Lane. a woman he had briefly dated before their relationship ended in violence. The crime took place on August 2nd, 1988, in the quiet town of Cordova. After Karen ended their brief relationship, Hunt became increasingly jealous and obsessive. That night, he broke into her apartment and launched a savage attack. He beat Karen severely, sexually assaulted her, and then bludgeoned her to death. The autopsy revealed over 60 separate injuries. Tragically, her 6-year-old son was asleep in the home during the murder. He was unharmed, but awoke to find his mother's lifeless body the next morning, a trauma that would mark him for life. Hunt fled the scene but was arrested a few days later. In 1990, a Walker County jury convicted him of capital murder committed during a rape and burglary. 11 jurors voted in favor of the death penalty, and the judge formally imposed the sentence. Over the next 3.5 decades, Hunt's appeals were repeatedly denied. He ultimately admitted his guilt and, during his time in prison, became a born-again Christian. Fellow inmates began referring to him as Pastor Hunt for leading Bible studies and offering spiritual guidance behind bars. In an interview just weeks before his death, Hunt told the Associated Press that he had gotten free of his demons and prayed daily for Karen Lane's family. Still, her relatives insisted that forgiveness did not mean forgoing justice. For them, the pain of her loss never faded, and the cruelty of the crime demanded full accountability. Hunt's execution marked Alabama's second use of nitrogen hypoxia, a new method introduced due to ongoing challenges sourcing lethal injection drugs. His legal team challenged the use of nitrogen, pointing to disturbing reactions observed in a previous execution involving the gas. But the courts allowed it to proceed, and Hunt, having accepted his fate, did not request clemency or resist the timeline. At Holman Correctional Facility, Hunt was strapped to a gurney and fitted with a sealed hood. He declined to make a final verbal statement, but raised a thumbs up and peace sign, a silent farewell to witnesses. At 5:55 p.m., nitrogen gas began flowing. Within 2 minutes, his body began to shake. Witnesses reported that he gasped, moaned, and briefly lifted his head before falling still. His face turned blue, and by 6:05 p.m., he showed no signs of movement. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. C.D.T. Hunt did not request a special last meal. On the day of his execution, he skipped dinner and ate only a light lunch of bologna, black-eyed peas, and fruit punch. After the execution, Karen Lane's family issued a statement saying, "This isn't about closure, it's about justice." They noted that Hunt had spent more time alive on death row than Karen had in her entire life, a sobering reminder of the impact of violent crime. Alabama's Attorney General echoed the sentiment, calling Hunt's execution long overdue justice for a stolen life. Number 22. Stephen Christopher Stanko. Stephen Christopher Stanko, age 57, was executed in South Carolina on June 13, 2025, for a pair of brutal murders committed just hours apart in April 2005. On April 8 of that year, Stanko, recently paroled after serving time for a violent offense, killed his live-in girlfriend, 43-year-old Laura Ling, in Georgetown County. During a violent attack, he strangled her and assaulted her teenage daughter. Though he slit the 14-year-old's throat, she survived. The following morning, Stanko drove to Horry County, where he murdered his 74-year-old friend Henry Lee Turner by shooting him in the head and emptying his bank account using forged checks. A multi-day manhunt ended with Stanko's arrest. He was tried separately for both murders and received 2 death sentences, one in 2006 for Ling's murder and a second in 2009 for Turner's killing. These back-to-back crimes shocked South Carolina and led to Stanko becoming one of the few inmates in the state with multiple active death sentences. Stanko's case drew national attention partly due to South Carolina's shifting execution protocols. For years, executions were on hold due to legal disputes over drug availability and methods. In 2022, the state enacted a new law allowing executions by electric chair or firing squad if lethal injection drugs were unavailable. Stanko initially considered choosing the firing squad, as had several inmates before him, but later opted for lethal injection after observing inconsistencies and complications in past executions. Leading up to his execution, Stanko's legal team challenged the constitutionality of South Carolina's protocol, citing concerns over pulmonary edema and potential suffering during the injection. They also argued that the state had unfairly discouraged use of the firing squad due to bad publicity. Federal courts rejected both claims. In his final appeals, Stanko acknowledged his guilt, but requested mercy based on his remorse and efforts to rehabilitate. He wrote apology letters to the families of both victims, stating he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped his death would offer them peace. Stanko was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution and pronounced dead at 6:34 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. In a 3.5-minute final statement, he turned toward the witness room and addressed the victims' families by name. He offered repeated apologies and said, "I hope you don't judge me by the worst day of my life." He asked for their prayers, saying he had lived with the weight of his actions every day since. As the pentobarbital was administered, Stanko's lips moved as if in silent prayer. His breathing quickened, then slowed as his face paled. Due to his large body mass, a second dose was administered roughly 13 minutes in. He was pronounced dead nearly 28 minutes after the procedure began. Observers said he showed no violent reactions, just light quivering before falling still. Throughout the execution, 3 relatives of the victims watched in silence. For his final meal, Stanko requested a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke from a local diner he had liked in his youth. He ate the full meal and reportedly told guards it reminded him of better days. South Carolina corrections officials noted that his execution was the last in a planned series for the first half of 2025. Afterward, Laura Ling's daughter and Henry Turner's son both made statements to reporters. They acknowledged that while an execution can't undo the pain or bring back loved ones, they felt a measure of justice. Both said they appreciated hearing Stanko's apology and that it helped bring closure to a tragedy that had haunted them for 2 decades. And that brings us to the end of the video. If you've made it this far, thank you. It really means a lot. Make sure to drop a like if you found this interesting, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the full update we'll be posting at the end of the year. I'd love to know what you think. Which of these cases stayed with you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Let me know down in the comments. If you want more stories like this, tap right to watch Teens Who Committed Unbelievable Crimes, or tap left to dive into the most dangerous MS-13 women ever caught. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.